Okay, so I want to talk about experience. I have experiences. I don't consider myself unique in this respect, although actually I'm going to come to that in a minute. But I have experiences. When I step outside, I feel the cold air and I see the blue of the sky. I presume that you guys also do. I presume that rocks don't. So on a sort of a common sense taxonomy, there are things that have experiences and there are things that don't have experiences, and then there are things that we're just not sure about, right? So people, we're intact and awake people, right? And we just saw, there are lots of really interesting, difficult cases. But people have experiences. I'm pretty sure that some animals do, although I don't really know how to argue that, but I think, we're convinced that our family pets have experiences. There's something that it's like to be them. I think that rocks probably don't have experiences. Not probably. Rocks don't have experiences. Paper clips don't have experiences. Clouds and galaxies don't have experiences. And at least this is common sense. Philosophers are not always going to be too constrained by common sense. And there's, it turns out, like you may know, in recent years, panpsychism has become a big thing, and it's the view that everything has experiences, and that may include paper clips, and it may not, and so there are people who are like actively debating with each other about whether paper clips have experiences. I'm not going to go down that road today, but I wanted to mention. And then there are other cases that I think are that are serious. Difficult, tricky cases. So it's unclear whether fish have experiences. It's unclear whether insects have experiences. It's unclear whether. So I take it that a fertilized egg doesn't have experiences, but a toddler does. A human toddler does, and somewhere in there you start having experiences, and it might be interesting to know when. You'll have noticed from my accent that I come from a distant land where people care a lot about fetuses, so there are political issues here, and I think we'll hear more about that later today. Not with fetuses, I hope, but. So some of the issues this raises, one of the issues this raises is a traditional, well-known problem known as the problem of other minds, and I want to call it the skeptical problem of other minds to distinguish it from a different problem of other minds. But so it goes like this, and Davinia kind of alluded to this early in her presentation, right? So I know by introspection that I have experiences, right? So I know that this thing feels slightly cool and slippery and smooth and squishy, right? And how do I know that that's how it feels? I just kind of look inward and I know that that's how it feels. Right? So I know that I'm having a certain visual experience, etc. I know that by looking inward, but I can't know that way about you. Maybe I can know those things about you, but if I know those things about you, I don't know them in the same way that I know them about me, because I know them about me by introspecting, but I can't introspect you. I can only introspect me. Right? So if whatever I know about what's going on inside your head, I have to know in some different way, and that's where the problem, the skeptical problem of other minds arises. Right? So your behavior and your similarity to me are really the only bits of evidence that I could be basing these beliefs on. Right? I can base them on the fact that you are shaped roughly like me, that I have evidence for thinking that you're genetically related to me, that you behave in certain ways, that sort of stuff. Right? But insofar as it's all just an argument from your similarity to me, right, here's the one thing that I know has experiences, and then I generalize that to all the rest of you. That looks like a classic bad inference, right? It looks like a generalization from a sample of one, and we're supposed to not generalize from small samples, right? So that looks like a classic textbook bad inference. That is the skeptical problem of other minds, right? I mean, it's the problem of explaining how it is that we can think that anybody else in the world has experiences. Now, there's an interesting feature, I think, about skeptical questions. They tend to have this kind of format, right? So how do I know that others have experiences? Right, that's the one we've just been asking. But if you've ever read David Hume, right, you'll know the following question, right? How do I know that the sun will rise again tomorrow? Well, it always has risen in the past. And I think the things that I haven't observed will resemble the things that I have observed, and so it'll rise again tomorrow. But what's my grounds for thinking that things that I haven't observed will resemble things that I have observed? Well, now it becomes troublesome, right? Because you can't know that on the basis of observation, because it's about things that you haven't observed, and it looks like you can't know it a priori, so it looks like you can't know it at all. Oh no, right? Now it looks like we can't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. How do I know that there are material things, right? How do I, well, on the basis of the senses, but how do I know that my senses are reliable? How do I know that I'm not a disembodied spirit being deceived by some evil genius, some demon, into thinking that there's a world around me, etc.? Right? So you'll recognize these. Some of you will recognize these as the problem of other minds, the problem of induction, the problem of the external world. Now, these kinds of how do I know X questions, one of the things I think is kind of interesting about them is that the more obvious X is, the harder it is to answer these questions, right? I mean, so it's obvious that others have experiences. It's obvious that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. It's obvious that there's a material world. And the very fact that it's obvious is what makes it really difficult to answer these questions. Contrast these with scientific questions, like how do I know that the Earth's continents are on moving tectonic plates? That should be harder, right? But actually, it's really easy to answer, right? I mean, it's easy to explain how it is that we know, right, that the continents are on moving tectonic plates. I mean, I don't have all the details at my fingertips, right? But it has to do with, the way the continents fit together and the stuff that we see in the ocean floor and so on, right? And so that question is in a lot of ways easier to answer than the question about material things. And so when we ask this question, the skeptical problem of other minds question, how do I know that you have experiences? Right? When I ask that question, I think part of what's going on there is that I'm not really concerned about you when I ask that question. I'm concerned, it's all about me, it's not about you. It's about me, right? It's about my knowledge and not about your experiences. And that's what's distinctive about these skeptical questions, right? They're really epistemological, as we say, questions. They're questions about knowledge. They're not questions about geology. They're not questions about psychology. They're not questions really about what's really going on in the heads of other people. They're questions about what's going on in the head of the knower. So, in addition to those skeptical problems, there are real problems of other minds, right? How do we know that? So we know, okay, so just grant that I know that you guys have experiences and that you know that I have experiences and so on. How do we know that a certain system, a certain animal or person or a computer program is conscious? What counts as good evidence of consciousness? And I think what makes this a difficult question, even if we're setting aside the kind of outlandish skepticism, is that cognitive psychology and neuroscience have shown us that there are a whole lot of cognitive tasks that can be done on autopilot. Right, just in regular, in regular intact humans, there's a whole lot of stuff that we do that we can do without being aware that we're doing it. Getting a bit more esoteric, but still, not in the land of, sentient paperclips, right? We find that you can get a lot of sophisticated behavior out of animals that clearly are not having experiences. So you can decapitate insects and still teach them to move their limbs in certain ways. You can do something similar with vertebrates by severing the spinal cord, and then training that spinal cord to exhibit pain avoidance behavior. Now, on the, I think very plausible, I think you will think a plausible assumption that spinal cords don't have experiences, right? That experience happens in the brain, right? Then there are these things that you can get without consciousness, without experience, without any of that, right? And so it's a significant empirical question. So I'm calling this the real problem of other minds, in part for two reasons, because it's about other minds, not about my mind, right? The skeptical questions aren't about X. The skeptical questions, how do I know X? They aren't about X, they're about knowing. And it's not about, so it's genuinely about other minds and not about my knowledge. But also, it's a serious problem in the sense that it's grounded in empirically motivated methodological concerns, right? I mean, that is, we see these kinds of behaviors that we take to indicate consciousness, but we see that these things are producible in the absence of consciousness. So it's not based on frivolous worries about mere possibilities. When I say frivolous, I mean frivolous in this context. I mean, I think in epistemological contexts, those worries are not frivolous. But I think if we're not doing epistemology, if our concern isn't knowledge, but our concern is what's going on in the heads of these animals, then they're frivolous. Okay. So I think one way of trying to address this is to ask what it is that consciousness is doing for the creature. Right? What does consciousness do? Specifically, what is a creature with consciousness able to do that a creature without consciousness isn't? So, of course, it's going to depend on what you mean by consciousness. There's a familiar distinction. It's not entirely uncontroversial, but it's a distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. I think it's kind of useful. I'm going to use it. So access consciousness is availability for verbal report. It's introspectability, right? So a state is access conscious when I can tell by introspection that I'm in it, and I can report on it. I can use it in planning. I can use it in the deliberate control of action, etc. Phenomenal. To say that a state is phenomenally conscious is to say that it has qualitative or phenomenal character. That is, there's something that it's like to be in that state. So I think when we talk about experiences, we typically mean, they tend to be both, but it's the phenomenal part that we're usually interested in. Okay, now here's a kind of fairly standard view about access consciousness. And again, it's going to be controversial. People are going to deny it, but it's a view that's out there. It's got some currency. So access consciousness is just presence in working memory. So working memory is a limited capacity short-term store that serves as a sort of a centralized mental workspace in which to bring together and to integrate information from various sources, from long-term memory, from imagination, from the various senses, bring it together for the purposes of executive control. If that's what access consciousness is, and let's just suppose it is, right? If that's what access consciousness is, then a creature has consciousness. A creature is conscious in the sense of having access consciousness, just in case it has working memory. We know what access consciousness does for an organism, or at least we know some of what it does, right? It gives a creature new forms of executive control and the ability to solve novel problems, right? I mean, so this is probably why we have working memory, is because it allows us to solve new problems, right? Problems that are not evolutionarily anticipated or overlearned. And what's nice about this is that we can empirically determine whether a creature has, we can study, we can investigate empirically creatures' working memory. We can tell whether they have working memory. We can see whether, we can determine what the capacity is, right? So some people have a larger working memory span than other people, and that difference has all these other kinds of consequences for like reading comprehension and success in life and things like that. So that, I don't think there's I don't think that there's a really pressing problem for access consciousness, right? I mean, that is, we can find out whether things have access consciousness or not. There's a residual problem, because access consciousness doesn't entail phenomenal consciousness, right? That is, right, I mean, that is, as far as we can tell, a creature could be, we typically aren't, right? So there's a lot of overlap between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness in us. But as far as we could tell, a creature could be access conscious without there being anything that it's like to be that creature. Access consciousness in that sense doesn't entail phenomenal consciousness. So how can we tell that a creature has phenomenal consciousness? I think to tell that, we need to know what it is that phenomenal consciousness does for a creature. We know what access consciousness does for a creature. It lets them solve problems, gives them executive control, it enables certain kinds of sophisticated behavior. But why couldn't an access conscious zombie do all of these things, right? I mean, why couldn't you have access consciousness and a working memory and still have there be nothing that it's like on the inside, still all dark? So I want to just propose something kind of speculative and see what folks think about it. So there's a view out there. Again, it's controversial, and I think some of you don't like it. Called phenomenal. The idea is phenomenal overflow, and so the idea is that phenomenal consciousness has a greater capacity than access consciousness. We're access conscious of only a part of what we're phenomenally conscious of. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But one thing that comes up again and again, and I think this is probably a bit of an oversimplification. I mean, I think working memory is probably more complicated than philosophers at least think it is. But a standard view that you hear is that working memory holds 4 items. It seems like we're phenomenally conscious of more than 4 items. Right now, I seem to be phenomenally conscious of a whole lot more than 4 items. Now, maybe I'm just moving around really quickly from one thing to the other, but it seems like I'm like my experience, my overall experience includes more than just 4 little chunks. So here's the proposal then. And the proposal is that what phenomenal consciousness does for a creature is provides a sort of a virtual working memory. Effectively expanding the capacity beyond 4 items. So here's a metaphor. Unfortunately, this is all going to be metaphor. So think of a spotlight, right, which shines. I mean, we think of attention as a spotlight, and we think of consciousness sometimes as a spotlight. So a spotlight that lights up a certain thing. Now think of a spotlight that has a penumbra. Right? I mean, so it lights up that central part, but then it has this, kind of shadowy, bigger stuff that it also partly illuminates, but it doesn't fully illuminate. So I think it would be good to have a penumbra, right? I mean, so a creature that can see one item and can see it clearly is great. But it's better if you can also see other stuff, even if you can't see them as well. I mean, this is really, again, kind of metaphorical, but if there's clear focal information and then available penumbral information, that would be a handy thing. And so maybe we have a penumbral working memory that would have a higher capacity than the 4 items that fit in working memory. Information in there would be raw and not processed. It's probably encoded in a different way than the stuff that's in actual working memory in that 4 items. It'd be less conceptual. It would maybe be in a different format. Some people think that it would be like in an iconic rather than like a picture-like rather than a language-like kind of format. Information in the penumbra would be insufficient for report and deliberation and problem solving, right? Because it's not in access consciousness. It's not in working memory. Nevertheless, it could be sufficient for the deliberate allocation of attention within that perceptual field. And so a creature with a penumbral working memory would be faster and more efficient at shifting attention within that perceptual field than one without. And that's something then that we would be able to observe empirically. So the proposal, and I know I'm being quick because it's a quick format here, but the proposal is that phenomenal consciousness supplements working memory. It makes up for the limited capacity. Working memory holds 4 items, but it's nice to be conscious of more than that. But if you're stuck with a working memory that only holds 4, it'd be nice to have a different thing. If so, then creatures that have phenomenal consciousness should behave differently in working memory tasks than creatures that don't have it. And that's all I have time for. So, thanks.